بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. القارية ما القارية وما أدراك ما القارية يوم يكون الناس كالفراش المبثوث وتكون الجبال كالإهن المنفوش فأما من ثقلت موازينه فهو في عيشة راضية وأما من خفت موازينه فأمه هاوية وما أدراك ما هي نار حامية. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. By the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're gathered here on this glorious occasion to celebrate Eid Ghadeer, Ghadeer Khumm, which inshallah historically would take place in a few days' time. But even in celebrating it a little prematurely, inshallah we can take away the most important lessons that we need to implement in our lives. Just as the young brother recited Surah Al-Qari'ah, that surah towards the end, it highlights the difference between those whose weight in good deeds is expensive and those who have a very light weight when it comes to good deeds. And that's the separation between those who are saved in the afterlife and those who are doomed. So insha'Allah ta'ala, we can try and work towards building our good deeds, our habits, our akhlaq, because that is how we truly honor the memory of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam in Eid Ul Ghadeer and the Holy Prophet, of course. Inshallah, as you know, tonight will be a youth panel discussion. I pray it's an interactive program and one that is extremely beneficial and engaging. To begin the program, I would like to invite Brother Mustafa Bismi to deliver the first presentation. Please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace and blessings to you all. I'd like to congratulate you on this auspicious occasion. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the event of Ghadeer, right? This being the approaching the event of Eid Ul Ghadeer, and this is something that when I was growing up, I grew up in a mixed Muslim family. I was just telling Brother Sadiq that I'm from South India, right? And South India, when I went to South India, I quickly learned that my immediate family is like the only Shia family in the whole of South India. Like, I didn't even know this. There's not much, Shia footprint down there, right? And so I grew up with most of my family being Sunni, right? And my immediate family, they converted before I was born. And so I learned about Shia Islam and Sunni Islam growing up. And when I did, Eid Ul Ghadeer and the event of Ghadeer was quite polarizing, right? We'd have a lot of discussions, actually, about the event of Ghadeer. And that forced me to learn about it for my own sake, right? Because a lot of people come up to me and question me about, beliefs in Shia Islam. And I really respect that, looking back at it, because, it made me prepared to, have an answer ready, right? At least know it for my own sake. And, I didn't want to inherit the religion of my parents. I wanted to learn it for myself, right? I think there's a bit of dignity in that. And so, I used to always research this up. And I didn't just want to research it from the perspective of, Shia scholars. I wanted to see what Ghadeer was like from the perspective of other Muslims. And so there's a book called Peshawar Nights. I don't know if you guys have heard about it. Have you heard about it, Hussein? Peshawar Nights is a debate that they had between, they call it the well-wisher and the hafiz, between Shia scholars and Sunni scholars, several hundred years ago. Around 100 years ago. That's not too long ago. And it's all about, the arguments put forth about Ghadeer and the Imams and Imamat and, and it was a very civil debate. I don't know if you guys have typed in Shia Sunni debate on YouTube, but let's be honest, it's not the most civil thing you've ever seen in your life, right? Yeah, civility has died since then. But when I started reading into that, I started to learn about Shia Islam from the perspective of non-Shia Islamic school of thoughts, right? And then it dawned onto me that people started coming up to me and they started saying like, oh, Shia Islam, they want Imam Ali to be the successor of the Prophet because he is the cousin and the son-in-law of the Prophet. That's sort of like, keep the power in the bloodline kind of thing, right? And if you hear what, you ever hear like a non-Muslim explain what Islam is? You ever type in, I don't know, crash course, watch like, what is Islam? And the guy says, in Shia Islam, the Shias wanted Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet, to become, right? And you're thinking like, when you hear it like that, it's sort of like an unbiased approach, and you never saw it from that perspective, right? And then they say, in Sunni Islam, they wanted to elect Abu Bakr, the beloved companion of the Prophet, right? And so when you hear it like that, you realize that's how a lot of people see Shia Islam, from the outside looking in, right? We are obviously born and brought up in Shia Islam, and we see it from a different perspective, and we don't look at Imam Ali as just his cousin and his son-in-law. I mean, if anything, that's not like the strongest qualities of Imam Ali, right? There are many people who share blood relations to the Prophet that we don't hold so valuable in Islam. And so when I saw it like that, and people like, propose the idea that, Shias want to keep the power in the family, I started looking in the Holy Quran, and the Holy Quran talks about the Prophet saying, I do not ask anything from you. Surah Al-Shura. I do not ask anything from you except that you love and, devoutly support my family. And so when I was growing up, I was like, why would the Prophet just say that if his family was not like divinely appointed? That's a very strange thing to say. And Talib, if you study like if you look at dictators throughout history, they want to keep the power line in their family, right? They want to hand the power down to their son. And a dictator will say, after me, I want you to follow and support my son and my family. And that's very like typical of dictators, right? And so you gotta see if the Prophet and his family is not that important, then him saying, follow and support my muhabba is like devoutly supporting, follow my family. That's a very weird thing to say if your family's nobody. You know what I mean? It's like, why are we supporting, Ali? Oh, my son-in-law, look, he doesn't have a job. Can you make him the Khalifa after me? It's really weird. Just make him, you got to support him. It's a very weird thing to say if he's a nobody, right? Why would the Quran say that? And it's not befitting of the Prophet to say something like that if his family didn't mean anything, right? Prophet Noah didn't say, oh, support my son, he's my son. You know what I mean? We don't support, for example, Nabi Harun because he's the brother of Musa, just because he's his brother. That's not why we support him, right? And so when I looked into it, the Quran mentions a lot of things about the Prophet's family, which is very strange because in non-Shia school of thought, the Prophet's family is not really mentioned all that much. And there's not much importance given to the Prophet's family. And I know this because I grew up going to Islamic lectures. I grew up, going to Jummah prayers. I grew up going to the madrasa in both Shia and Sunni. And so I learned, the Prophet's family doesn't really mean a whole lot to non-Shia school of thought. And so when the Quran says, Surah Ahzab, Surah number 33, verse 33, indeed Allah intends to remove all impurities from you, O Ahlul Bayt, and it intends to purify you with a thorough purification. that is very strange to mention that, especially if your whole religion, the Prophet's family is like, oh yeah, it's his family, he's good, they're good people, and we love and support them. That's the extent that most Muslims hold to the Prophet's family. But when the Quran talks about like thorough purification, it's very odd, right? And that's why I'm saying, like, you have to look at when you hear a non-Muslim guy explain Islam, it's a very unbiased approach. And when you hear it from that perspective, that why does the Quran hold a lot of importance to the Prophet's family? And, my whole life I haven't realized that, we don't really pay too much attention to the Prophet's family. You got to see it from that perspective. Maybe things don't add up, right? And that's one thing I learned really early on, that if the Quran is the deciding book between different schools of thought onto which people can find the truth, it doesn't make sense to rule out the Prophet's family, right? Now you look at the words of the Surah Ahzab when it talks about thorough purification. This is something I didn't really understand. What does that mean? What does purification mean? Like they get like a really good shower or something? That didn't make any sense to me growing up. It's only when I looked into it did I realize what purification meant. And this question was asked to Imam Jafar as-Sadiq by one of his close companions. The Imam says, thorough purification in that verse is referring to the removal of doubt, right? And doubt is the bane of intelligence, right? And intelligence and knowledge and wisdom and insight being the foundation of the imamate. This is another thing of why Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen is in the position that he is in, to be the successor of the Prophet. It's not because he's a son-in-law. It's not because he happened to claim, be the first Muslim when he's a boy or something like that. That's not the defining, quality that makes him the successor of the Prophet. It is this idea of imamate. And this was when I looked at imamate in Shia Islam. I wanted to see if other schools of thought held that same view. And I realized that's not how it works, right? If you look at what guardianship and infallibility and how it's defined in non-Shia schools of thought in Islam, you'll realize that the way they approach it is, when the Prophet is delivering a message, he has some sort of aura of infallibility, right? As soon as he leaves the message and leaves the process of passing on the message, he becomes back to a human form. Sort of as if like the angel is slapping his hand if he makes a sin when he's delivering the message, and outside of that, he's back to a human form. And that's why they propose that argument. If you look into Surah Abasa, Surah 80, I believe, it's interpreted that the Prophet frowned at a blind man, and he made a mistake, I'm sorry about it. He was not in the infallible form, and that's why he was able to make a mistake, right? But the way Shia Islam looks at infallibility is completely different. And this is one of the defining qualities of how Shia Islam looks at the qualities of the prophethood and imamate, and how infallibility is defined by their intellect and defined by their insight. As Allama Tabatabai is so well put in his tafsir, he says that infallibility is not that they can't commit sin, right? It's that they choose not to commit sin through their intellect. And that's a defining quality that distinguishes right and wrong, that they can, avoid sin. Whereas non-Muslims will, non-Shias will view like infallibility as some sort of like guardianship aura of God, moving the hand like a puppeteer. But that's not how we see it. And it's really interesting when you look deeper and deeper into it. You realize that the imams are not like some sort of angels, right? We are given intellect ourselves, and to a good extent, we avoid sins. There are many, very immoral sins that even our own nafs, our own fitra, will avoid doing so, right? And that trait is present in the imams, and that's why we support and follow them. I mean, that defining quality of imamate is what makes Imam Ali the rightful successor, and no quality can be, assessed from the remaining companions to fit that criteria. And so that was one of the greatest lessons I learned growing up as a kid, and I think an important lesson I would like to pass on is to recognize that this religion should not be simply inherited by your parents, and it's something that for your own dignity, for your own sake, you should be ready to at any cost when someone asks you. You should have like grounded answers for yourself that you can prepare in response. With that being said, I would like to pass it back to Brother Hussein. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Jazakallah khair, Brother Mustafa. Just as you mentioned, Islam is not something that can be inherited. And this in fact goes back to one of the great sayings of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam in Bihar al-Anwar. He says, لا يستعان على الدهر إلا بالعقل. This means nothing can withstand the changes in time except for aql, reason, not lineage, not inheriting something, nothing like that. When we use our reason, our faculties of intellect that you mentioned, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made to distinguish us from the beasts, that's how we're truly able to rise on an individual level and recognize the religion of Islam and the value of the Ahlul Bayt the way we truly should. The other point you mentioned, succession based on bloodline, this is a very common issue. Of course, there's no place in the religion for that whatsoever, as you mentioned. Look at Abu Lahab, uncle of the Prophet. He's cursed in the Holy Quran. Look at so many of the relatives of the Holy Prophet, the way they behaved. Terrible. On the other hand, you look at someone like Salman al-Farsi from Persia, no blood relation to the Prophet whatsoever, and yet he was the highest amongst the companions of the Holy Prophet and Imam Ali. Same as Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, radiyallahu anhu. May Allah bless them both, insha'Allah ta'ala. Indeed, we need to learn our religion through employing our faculties of reason. Last point you mentioned, of course, I vaguely recall, the perspective of outsiders. That's something very interesting, because usually it's the case, as you mentioned, outsiders view our sect or our perspective as one which favors family bloodlines, whereas our brothers in the other sects, they're often seen as people who believe in some kind of political process in order to elect a person in a leadership position of some kind. But that couldn't be further from the truth when you actually examine the history in the detail that you should. When you examine what took place during the events of Saqifa, all of these kinds of things, how the political manipulations took place, intimidation, all these kinds of things, and threats were used. And, all of this was being done while Imam Ali and the family of the Prophet were washing his body, so it was the will of Allah that the Muslims, they happened to neglect the Ahlul Bayt at large and not remember them the way that they should have. Alhamdulillah, we have this great legacy behind, and the only way we can keep it alive, as you mentioned, using our intellect, not just on an individual level, but across the board, changing the way we do things, the way we approach things, how we look at the sayings and examples of the Ahlul Bayt. Insha'Allah ta'ala, please recite a loud salawat for Brother Mustafa. With that, I would like to invite our next speaker, Brother Muhammad Sadiq, to deliver the presentation for tonight. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Either way.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I begin in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. All praise be to Allah, the creator of the universe. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight on this chilly evening. Inshallah, this discussion can be warming to the heart. I want to frame a little story here, rooted in the Quran. Nabi Abraham, the father of nations, literally, Avraham in Hebrew, is tested on multiple occasions, and he is the father, essentially, of all monotheistic faiths, or not all, but the Abrahamic tradition as we know it today, right? Now, Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam is commanded to sacrifice that which he loves most, right? And that is his son. In that, he is tested and he is successful in that test. And we've just come out of the season of Hajj. And in that season, it is the time that we sacrifice that which we love most. But something really interesting happens. There is this little exchange in the Quran which is quite noticeable. And it's found in Surah Al-Baqarah, usually around verse 124. And it says, when Abraham's Lord tested him with certain commandments which he fulfilled, he said, my Lord, will you make a leader of the people? Abraham asked, and will you make leaders from my descendants too? And God said, my pledge does not hold for those who do evil. Also translated as injustice. So here we have a very interesting point that leaders are appointed based on merit here. And now let's turn to Ghadeer. So Ghadeer happens after the Hajj. The Prophet gathers everyone. Bilal is told to gather everyone. They come. And they have this little exchange. They're there at this little pond, so to speak. And the Prophet gets up and he makes the announcement that after me, it shall be Ali, in simple terms, right? Yet, it's quite interesting that we commemorate this event almost every year as a Eid. It's a celebration. It's a commemoration of some sort. The question is why? And I think the answer lies, and feel free to pitch in later on, but I feel as though the answer is simply because leadership is an integral aspect of faith. When Allah says, Al-yawma akmaltu dinakum, on this day, I have completed your religion, He is speaking about the fact that leadership is the completion of religion. The question is, what is leadership? How do we assess what this notion is? Is it found in the Quran? Is it found in the Hadith? Short answer is, yes, it's found in both, right? I'm going to harp on like a broken record for now. So bear with me, please. So the first thing is that there are various qualities and attributes of leadership in the Quran. And when we find these attributes and qualities of leadership in the Quran, we often find them associated with particular characters as opposed to groups. So for example, when it comes to the notion of Nabi Musa alayhi salam, he is often known for his honesty and his steadfastness in speech and whatnot. When we find it with Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, again, steadfastness, integrity. When we find it with Nabi Sulaiman, we have wisdom. When we have Nabi Dawood, also the notion of wisdom and impartiality. So here we have a plethora of universal values that if we look in every religion, they're promoted. But they're encapsulated in the final revelation, which is the Quran. So this is quite interesting. This brings us to the notion of imama or leadership in the Muslim Ummah. Now, the Muslim world has gone through heaps of change in the last 2 decades, largely due to colonialism. But it's quite interesting that if you look in the major 3 schools of thought, theologically, we have the Ibadi, we have the Sunni, we have the Shia. The notion of leadership doesn't escape any of them. The nature of the leadership is something of dispute. Is it political? Is it spiritual? Is it this? Is it that? Fair enough. There are disputes and there's room for dispute there. But leadership in of itself is universal across all 3 schools of thought. It's quite interesting that if we look through the Sufi tariqas, even Irfan, but Irfan comes under the branch of Shiism generally, but if we look at Sufism in particular, every Sufi order comes through the leadership, through the wilaya, through the guardianship of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. With the exception of one, the Naqshbandi say that they go through Abu Bakr and Imam Ali, and that's because they go through Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, who has lineage to 2. But quite interestingly, they all go through Imam Ali. The Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, if you look at the Hanafi school of thought, in the deduction of jurisprudence and hadith and reason and whatnot, the method usually is derived from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ali ibn Abi Talib. So once again, we have Imam Ali as a leader in jurisprudence. If you want to go by extension even further, we have the Maliki school of thought, we have the Hanafi school of thought, and the Shafi'i school of thought. All 3 schools of thought, and including the Hanbali as well, because sort of came out of the Shafi'i school of thought, it all came out through Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and eventually Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. Once again, going back through the thought of Imam Ali alayhi salam. Wherever you go, there is this notion of leadership. It's inescapable in Islam. The question is, why is leadership so important? And the next question is, how is it relevant to our lives? I mean, is it just that we get up every year and we say, There was this guy called Imam Ali, and he's a really cool guy. He used to slay people on the battlefield. The bloke was a good rider, he was a good farmer, good businessman. That's it, he's just a top bloke. I'm rooting for him. Or is it something deeper than that? Does it have any material effect on our personal life? I argue that it's the latter. That this notion of imama or wilaya, yes, it has its external aspect, which is that, yes, we have our authority coming from Imam Ali, but Imam Ali acts as an archetype which we have to, in our lives, emulate and become, that we have to manifest. So, bear with me for one moment. Really, if we boil it down, if we look at Imam Ali, why did the Prophet choose him amongst all the companions? I mean, if we want to go based on intellect, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was an excellent hafiz. He was an excellent reciter. He knew his fiqh very well, and he's respected across both schools of thought. Abu Bakr was a very pragmatic person. If you look at the Ridda Wars, he was a very pragmatic person. How come he wasn't a leader? Or, for example, we look at Umar. He was very charismatic. He could really mobilize people. He mobilized people against Persia, mobilized people into North Africa. It's quite interesting. But why does the wilaya go to Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib? Fundamentally, the reason that I've sort of found is that Imam Ali alayhi salam worked on a few things and perfected it. He had that aspect of ihsan. So ihsan is the striving for excellence, and we all have it in our lives. But it's essentially starting something and completing it to its fullest, and in doing so, manifesting some attribute of Allah. That's why, there are numerous ahadith saying that the imams are the manifestation of God's attributes on earth, right? It's because they manifest God's attributes through their actions. All right, crystal clear as daylight, fair enough. How does this relate to anyone here? How does it relate to us? Each and every one of us have our own struggles, akin to the imams. I mean, scholars have looked at the imamate, the 12 imams, and they've said, all right, there are generally 3 periods. You have the period of power, of political power, so the first few imams. And then you have the period of education, so from Imam Zain al-Abidin, perhaps down to Imam al-Qadim. And then you have the period of social equity, so sort of from the Imam Rida sort of onwards. We find that, they have this striving for justice through the awqaf, almost like not-for-profit charitable organizations. So they're the general 3 periods. But it's quite interesting that despite the change in the circumstances, there is still a manifestation of imama and leadership. And what that means is that leadership in of itself is a very flexible concept that can be applied to various situations depending on the circumstance. So for example, in the period of Imam Ali alayhi salam, there was this strive for political equity and justice, and the means was through politics and the perfection of politics. That was one. Or for example, let's go through Imam Muhammad al-Baqir. Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam achieved his leadership through education and educating as many people as possible, yet he was recognized as a leader. And finally, for example, Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam was a master in administering the khums money to those that to the areas that were needed, where the government or the Abbasid Caliphate were neglecting. So it's quite interesting. So let's back up a bit now. Interestingly, yes, from a theological perspective, there were 12 imams and there's a lineage and whatnot, and it's preordained by God, yes. But we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people at the time when we look at our imams. Because with respect, and I'm not putting their position down, the reality is, when you saw the imam was a human being. He's like any other Joe Blow. It's not like in the movies where you see the Noor coming out and you're like, yeah, that's the imam on the screen. It wasn't like that in real life. It was just another person. But what made the people recognize the imam at the time? And fundamentally what it comes down to is their own merit. Yes, they're ordained by God, but in the credibility and in the eyes of the public, it was their own actions that manifested them as leaders and imams of the time. So it's a twofold thing. Yes, Allah has chosen them, but they also chose Allah in their lives. And because of that, they became leaders. So, all right, we have that form of theological leadership. Now let's bring it down to our level, right? How can each and every, a mini imam, we can't be one of the 12 imams, one of the greats, there can't be a 13th imam, but how can we be a little mini imam? And I think it comes down to ihsan once more, the perfection and the striving for excellence, trying to become the insanu kamil, the complete human being. And the interesting thing is, when we look at the lives of the imam, each and every one of them manifested leadership in their own unique way, unique to their personality, unique to their character. So for example, right, I study film. My strive in life maybe to be the best film director. And in being a good film director, perhaps imparting social values, encouraging moral behavior, and that could be my area of being a leader. And through my merit in film, perhaps I could be a mini imam, I hope. I'm not quite there yet, right? We may have people in this room who are accountants and work in finance. It's the very same thing. If you can channel your skill for the betterment of the people, for upholding justice, like in Surah Al-Baqarah 124, Nabi Ibrahim, upholding justice, perfecting what you can do and using it not only to glorify God on a spiritual level, but also helping people, you become a leader. It could be being a mother, being there for your children, being that role model, that stability in the home. That in of itself is a form of leadership. And no task is any less than another. In Surah Al-Nahl, the Surah of the bee, it's quite interesting. Why the example of the bee? Well, generally in bee colonies or beehives, we have three forms of bees. We have the drone bees, we have the worker bees, and we have the queen bee. But you take one out of the equation, the hive falls. Each and every one of us have been gifted by Allah with a unique trait and a unique personality. We need to find that unique trait. Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. The one who knows himself knows their Lord. Find that trait that you are really good at. Manifest it, perfect it. Be that old Japanese craftsman who chips away at the wood one by one, chip, 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 and creates this beautiful, beautiful sculpture. If we could manifest that excellence in our virtue, in our character, in our conduct, then we are not only commemorating Ghadeer on an annual basis, but rather every moment of our lives. And that in itself is a ibadah. So what I've come to say today, it's been a bit all over the shop, but what I've come to say today is that we have the 12 Imams and they are immaculate, they are amazing. And we come here, Eid Ul Ghadeer, to remind ourselves of the importance of their leadership. But it doesn't stop there. That leadership must be translated into our daily action. And each and every one of us has a different role in society akin to the bees. And we must find what our purpose is and fulfill it. No matter how small, no matter how large, like the brother recited before, whoever does an atom's weight of good shall see it. And whoever does an atom weight of evil shall also see it. So let us pray that inshallah we manifest the excellence of the Imams. Let us pray that inshallah we can become mini Imams in our own right. I'll conclude on that note.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Jazakallah khair, Brother Muhammad. As always, an honor, very deep and insightful. No doubt, all of us have to find that passion, that drive, what we're most capable at, and bring that to the table. Because when we do that, all of us bring that front and center. That's when we realize our maximum potential as a community, as an ummah. Inshallah, we can do exactly that, where build a society where no one is held back in any way whatsoever, an open society where there's open discussion and dissection into the lives and examples of the Imams, the ahadith, something conceptual and deep. You know, as Brother Mustafa mentioned, something where you employ your faculties of intellect and reason. The other point that was interesting, you mentioned the different schools of the religion of Islam and how they have some kind of lineage or link back to the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt. It's actually interesting. I was speaking to a Sufi sheikh a couple weeks ago. He was mentioning this to me, a great Sufi scholar, one of the highest scholars, Abul Qasim ibn Muhammad al-Junaidi. He mentioned how his lineage in terms of teaching, in terms of his school, it goes back one after another until it reaches Imam al-Sajjad عليه الصلاة والسلام, Imam Zainul Abidin عليه الصلاة والسلام. And he goes on to mention some amazing examples of the Imam. Now this sheikh, he was mentioning something interesting to me. He said to me that without a doubt, I believe that the greatest person to walk on the earth after Rasulullah was Imam Ali عليه الصلاة والسلام. He mentions the name of Imam Ali. He says Imam and he also mentions alayhi salam after his name. And he isn't alone in this belief. There is another individual I spoke to from a Sunni background. They were mentioning that even though they believe Imam Ali was the most superior of the companions. They believe, because when you look into the history books, when you look at the narrations, the ahadith, this is the only conclusion you can come down to if you truly open your mind, if you're not subjective and you show favoritism to one person or the other. It's very clear that Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam is the cream of the crop. And last point I wanted to make about the political justice, that's so important looking back at how Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam governed and created his society. Because at that time, especially from the time of the third caliph, there was a lot of income inequality. There was a lot of corruption, oppression, nepotism, all of these kinds of things. You had a select few group of elite who were hoarding money from the Baytul Mal, the public treasury of the people. You know, you had this corruption all over the Muslim Ummah. When Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam comes into power, he brings back that legacy of the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, that system of justice, forgiveness, mercy and compassion on a governmental level. This is when the religion of Islam once again finds life in the Muslim Ummah, you know, after that life's been depleted so much. And Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam, he says something that's very famous, and I'm sure all of us would have heard of it in Nahj al-Balagha. He mentions that the people, they the people, are of two kinds, your brothers in Islam or your equals in creation. I can't recall the Arabic of that exactly. So this is the system by which he rules, and he gives this saying to his companion Malik al-Ashtar on his way to Egypt. This is how you should rule the people. When they make a mistake, show them mercy to the same extent that you would expect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to show you mercy. This is a very unique system of government that you wouldn't find anywhere except in those who are divinely appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once again, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad for the brother and his great presentation. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. Inshallah, I'll be very short in this segment because a lot of ground has been covered by the two brothers before me. May Allah bless them. Now, Ghadeer Khumm, just one major point I wanted to make, one kind of parallel which I found very interesting, and which Brother Muhammad Sadiq mentioned as well. The Prophet is returning from his farewell pilgrimage with anywhere between 100,000 to 120,000 companions. As he's returning, his retinue, his party, it's divided. There are some people who are ahead of the others. There are some people who are behind. Now when he stops at Ghadeer Khumm, at this location, he orders Bilal al-Habashi radiyallahu anhu, he orders him to bring back the people who have gone too far ahead and to bring forward those who have gone, who are too far behind. This is the instruction of the Holy Prophet. Now once this is done, he orders his companions to remove the saddles from the backs of their camels and pile them on top of each other to create a kind of makeshift minbar where he can speak and deliver his sermon. And this is where he declares Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam to be his rightful successor, grabbing his right hand, lifting it up, saying, Man kuntum mawlahu fahadha aliyun mawla. Of whosoever I am the master, then Ali is also his master. Now here's the interesting parallel that I found. When you look at the situation in the time of the third caliph, towards the end of his life, as I mentioned, when Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam was finally given his dues and chosen by the people, just as the party of the Holy Prophet were separated, just as some people were too far ahead, some people were too far behind, it was the same thing in the Muslim Ummah at that time. Some people had gone too far ahead, some people were too far behind. The very rich, they had hoarded too much wealth from the common people. The very poor, They were left hungry, poor, impoverished, neglected in the same way. And when Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam comes into power, he brings that full circle. He brings them all together, just as the Holy Prophet ordered Bilal, bring the people who have come ahead, bring them behind, and bring forward the people who are too far behind. This is the way Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam established his governmental system, a system of justice. And sometimes people argue that it wasn't entirely pragmatic, because they say that he should have chosen certain individuals to retain their power in order to sort of cut losses, in order to make sure that he wouldn't offend this person or that person, because that would secure his position. But that wasn't the way he ruled. He ruled based upon principle, upon merit, upon qualification, never upon what position this person might have, what wealth he might have, what influence he might have. Because of this, he made enemies, unfortunately. But even then, his system of government, it's something left for us behind, left behind for us to emulate and to consider. Now, just to finish, I'd like to refer back to a narration of the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, with respect to Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam. He says to him, and again, this is a very famous narration. I'm sure everyone has heard this one. أنا مدينة العلم وعلي بابها. I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. Now just pause and reflect upon this for a moment. A gate is the only way to enter a city. The only way to enter into the city of Islam, that city of knowledge, that city of the divine legacy that is left behind by the Holy Prophet, is through Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam. It cannot be entered any other way. And this is something I want to point out. Sometimes instead of even attempting to open that gate, it's a heavy gate, even attempting to open that gate and enter into that city of knowledge, we stop on the outside. Now again, think of the example of a gate. A gate or a door, it would have a keyhole. Instead of entering the gate, we pause and we look through the keyhole of that gate. Now think about when you look at something through a keyhole, you have a very limited perspective. There's so much that you cannot see. There's so much that you are deprived of seeing. This is the way we treat our Islam. We see it through a keyhole perspective, in the way we remember our Imams. Sometimes we simply chant the name of Ali or Hussein in an empty manner, without truly reflecting on the legacy that they left behind, without truly looking at their example and trying to emulate it in our lives. And this is something that Brother Mustafa mentioned as well. And I experienced the very same thing as I grew up. In our communities, oftentimes, Islam was looked at, Islam was treated in a keyhole perspective kind of way. Very narrow, very limited in its scope. Not conceptual, not deep, not engaging, not looking back to the narrations, the ahadith, and truly dissecting them, trying to understand what they mean, trying to implement them in order to resolve our contemporary issues, because that's the most important thing. When people come here, they want to leave with something that they can use in their lives, something useful, something practical. And when I look back into the teachings of the Imam at a younger age, I always used to ask myself, why did we not explore this in our programs, in our centers and everything? And alhamdulillah, I do feel we've made a lot of progress in this respect, but there's still so much room for improvement across different communities. So inshallah ta'ala, in order to truly remember Ghadeer, in order to truly honor the memory of Ghadeer Khumm, we can be the agents of change across our communities, our families, everywhere. Look into Islam from a wholesale perspective, from a comprehensive point of view. Open that door, that gate to the city of knowledge. Enter and see the value that is contained therein. Because the lives of the Ahlul Bayt, they're like a treasure, not a treasure of this world, but a treasure of the Akhirah that is beyond any other kind of treasure. And we need to benefit from that as much as possible. That is how we truly honor our beloved Imam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Jazakumullahu khairan. Inshallah, with that, we'll proceed to the main talk from Sheikh Ali Safdari for tonight. Please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أسعد الله أيامكم. Eid Mubarak. We had Eid Ul Adha that passed us, and currently we are celebrating Eid Ul Ghadeer a bit earlier, but there's every cause to celebrate this Eid as much as we can, before, after, during, inshallah. I benefited from the brother's contribution, both yourself and Brother Sadiq. I missed Brother Talib's presentation, but I'm sure it was good as well. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Ghadeer. And from an academic point of view, from a functional point of view, as Brother Sadiq was trying to touch upon in a way that could relate to our lives. But I'll try to maybe give a few points that increases our knowledge of the event from a historic and academic point of view, and also maybe a few tips for myself and for others on how that event and how this movement, rather, can become relevant to our lives and can become a functional part of our lives. The first thing that I want to mention is in regards to the Hadith of Radir. And the level of transmission that this Hadith has reached is unique when it comes to the Hadith corpus, whether that's the Sunni or the Shia heritage. It has reached the level of what the ulama in Arabic call tawatur. When a report, now whether that report is a report from Rasulullah or an Imam or anyone else for that matter, it's a statement, an event, and a piece of information. When you hear that from a variety of different sources, multiple sources that you trust or you don't trust, tens upon thousands of people inform you of an event that has occurred, it becomes highly unlikely for all of them to have conspired to tell a lie. And this idea of tawatur, this number of high transmissions that is related to Hadith Ul Ghadeer and a few other narrations, like the narration of I leave behind two weighty things, that's once again another transmission that has reached a high number of narrators and chains. To better understand the epistemological weight of this hadith, you have to consider it as the same weight as the Quran. The Quran has reached us by tawatur. The reason we believe that the Quran has been intact, yes, we have copies surviving the early years of Islam and Muslim history, but in reality, the strongest proof for the survival of the Quran and the way it is, it's tawatur. A simple example is that every generation, go back to your parents and their parents, everyone has recited, as a simple example, Surah Ikhlas, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, in the same way. You do not find variation. Hadith Ul Ghadeer, with the minute variations it has, is of the same level of the Quran when it comes to authenticity. Now imagine, sometimes we enter argument, discussion, academic or non-academic, hopefully more academic than just being purely polemical and to just put it over the other person. we say this is a hadith of Ghadeer, but this is like a verse of the Quran in terms of the weight it brings to the discussion. That's in regards to the sanad, as they say, or the chain of transmission that this hadith enjoys. When it comes to the content of the hadith, what this hadith has said, in particular that phrase, Man kuntu mawlah fahadha aliyun mawlah. Of course, no one denies that, once again, this was said. The debate, as you all are aware, is regards to the meaning of the term mawla. It's controversial, and there is reason to it. Mawla, like some other terms in Arabic, another term is ayn, al-ayn. In Arabic, some lexicons record up to, I believe, 40 meanings for one word. Usages, they can find this in history. They're not making it up. It's not a linguist having spare time on his own and finding or making up these meanings. No, they have been used in this particular way. Wali and walaya is one of those other terms. So many meanings have been used, and so many meanings have been used in the Quran. If one meaning had been used in the Quran and in the speech of the Prophet, then life would have been easy. We say the Prophet had always used this meaning, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had always used this meaning. But no, they would use it walaya as a form of help, walaya as a form of friendship, walaya as a form of authority. These are only a few meanings that I'm mentioning here. And we have the idea of wali in the sense of being a friend of God, that spiritual side to it. There is, of course, that famous debate between our Sunni brethren and us regards to the meaning of wali in this particular phrase. And the debate is old, you're all aware of it. I want to present a unique approach, perhaps a more modern approach, to which you and I, living in modern democracies, will understand much better than an audience of maybe even 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Let's review the reasons why we think the term wali means someone in authority. Mutawalli al-umur, the person who has the affairs of the people, of the ummah, their wealth, their livelihood, their decisions on engaging in war, in defending, in building cities, as a head of state. Let's see what we can find as historical indications with regards to Ghadeer, some of which you have heard, but the conclusion I will take from these indications, from these historical reminders, will be a bit different, and hopefully will be useful to you, and we can perhaps use this more often when engaging in discussion, and for ourselves as well. Why do I mention this? Why do I say for ourselves as well? It's because when we hear an opposing opinion, we do doubt ourselves. Like, hey, maybe they're right. Maybe we're conspiring here. Majority of the Muslims are going in one way. There's an appeal to the majority. Even subconsciously, sometimes we may not be aware of it. New Muslims can tell you this very much readily than you and I can ever feel as being brought up in the culture of Islam and being Muslim or being Shia. You speak to a new Muslim, imagine you entering a new faith. The majority already feels appealing. So to have an opposing side present an alternative version of history, an alternative interpretation of what happened, and this interpretation is not one that does not have serious consequences, rather the opposite. There are serious consequences to this interpretation. The whole religion changes its face, its appearance. So it's important to sometimes even reinsure our hearts. It's not always about taking the message out as if somehow we're always going to be firm on this path. The more we dig deeper into our intellectual history, the more we dig deeper into our tradition, into our books, not only our questions become more scarce, they become more. But hopefully the answers become better as well. The indications that I want to mention, let's begin with the location. The pond of Ghadeer and the area it was situated is an open land. not many mountains, no ups and downs. It's an area where if a person stood on a minbar, then he would be easily heard and he would be easily seen. It makes me think, it makes me think. It's something that I have no answer to, but maybe you guys can help me out. Rasulullah is almost threatened in the Holy Quran. فَإِن لَمْ تَبْلَغْ مَا بَلَغْتَ رِسَالَتَكَ. If you don't proclaim and profess this message to the people, let them know you have not done your job as the messenger. That's a bit of a threat. He's been, to put it loosely and colloquially, sweating all these years, putting all heart and blood into it. And Allah is saying, look, all of that, if you don't do this, it's nothing to me. There's a threat. Yet, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, his delay, if you like, makes the event happen in Ghadeer Khumm. Makes it happen at that location. Now, what's the wisdom behind it? I'm still thinking. There is a wisdom to the delay for it to reach this location. And there's a wisdom to the threat, the apparent seriousness of the matter. So maybe it was intended in a way. I don't know. But it's something to think about. Nonetheless, the location, an open land. No obstacles, visual or from an audio perspective. The timing. Rasulullah could have done this way earlier. Before the Hajj pilgrimage. Everyone is fresh. When you go to a gathering, the most important stuff, they try to say it when everyone is around. And they want to make sure that that's remembered. Everyone, I have invited you today to my house because it's Fulan's birthday, it's Fulan's marriage, or I'm doing this gathering as a nether so I could get married. People make it known that this is the purpose of the gathering. Yet he waits. He waits. Why? Because he does not want the events of Hajj, which is a unique event every year. It never surprises us. The Hajj always is surprising, always has something. It's a congregation of millions of people, and at that time, thousands of people. Rasulullah does not want the events of Hajj to somehow, and certain events in terms of our jurisprudence, in terms of our religion, did happen. It wasn't only the announcement of imamah and leadership that happened during this last Hajj. The fact that the Prophet is even talking about his departure is enough of a serious news. Nonetheless, he waits to the end. So nothing else could take the spotlight. Nothing else could be the spotlight of this event, of this year, of this Hajj, this pilgrimage, this famous pilgrimage the Prophet made. In terms of the audience, everyone is present from different nationalities. And they can all go back to their people to preach the message. The third indication. Fourth indication, while Brother Hussein was talking about, I was just putting the sentences together. Was talking about the Prophet asked people who had gone forward to join and those who were behind to once again join. I had something was inspired in Salawat al-Sha'baniyah and also in Ziyara Jama'a Kabira. We have an interesting phrase which is a parallel to what happened in Ghadeer. If I remember correctly, in Salawat Sha'baniyah, the terming is Al-Mutaqaddimu ankum mariq. The ones who are ahead of you, they have perished. They have lost the path. وَالْمُتَأَخِّرُ عَنْكُمْ زَاهِقٌ. And those of you who have fallen behind, once again they are perished. وَاللَّازِمُ لَكُمْ لَاحِقٌ. And those who join you, then those are the ones who are saved. We have a similar expression in Ziyara Jama'a Kabira. And subhanAllah, on this event that imamah takes place, the same thing almost physically happens. Rasulullah tells all the ones that have stepped ahead to join back with Imam. with the true leader, and those who have fallen behind to come back here. Of course, I'm trying to build a metaphor here, and the statements in those supplications are trying to tell us that we should never step and exceed more than the position that the Imam takes, nor fall behind. And unfortunately, we do that sometimes without realizing. May Allah safeguard all of us. Nonetheless, there is an emphasis to make sure everyone is present. Okay, multiple historical indications that our scholars and us as the Shia and Imamiyya use to say, look, this number of people, with the circumstances we just had described, it's highly unlikely that the Prophet called Imam Ali to say, in case you guys didn't know, we're besties. It's highly unlikely. But this is a different conclusion I want to present today so that we can take. We tell them, okay, no problem, we submit. The Prophet did all of these things with all these historical circumstances to say, Ali is my best friend. He raised his hand and he made sure everyone comes and gives him a hug, because it's a friendship party, right? It's not an allegiance. And everyone also said, yes, we can see that you guys are really good friends and very close. Picture this in today's politics and leaders. If you have a leader of a country and he has said that my death is approaching, and he takes all these steps to make sure everyone knows that there is someone he really likes and there is someone he really favors. What do political analysts, even the laymen, what do they understand from that? Even if it's just an expression of the friendship between these two individuals. It's obvious, anyone that sees it, it's clear that he just gave news of his departure and he professed his incredible love in an interesting and rather bizarre manner, putting everyone into difficulty to make sure they know they're besties. What conclusion can we take? And what's very interesting is that this proclamation of friendship, if we take it as friendship and not authority, is somehow weaker than the Prophet supposedly asking a companion to lead salat. That is used by our Sunni brethren and their scholars to indicate that the first Khalifa was the favorite to the Prophet because he was asked to lead the salat while the Prophet was weak. That is used as a stronger indication, according to them, of who the Prophet favored to be the leader. Yet this, no, Imam Ali just had a few problems with a few companions, and now it's time to let the people know that we're besties. This is somehow not enough of an indication. That, inshallah, can serve as what we can take away historically and academically, add to our knowledge of Ghadeer. So it's just not year in year we come here and we don't talk on a basis that every time we speak about an event, we actually add our information to the true facts to our understanding of that event. Because as you know, when we perform an analysis on a matter, our capital wealth is the data we have. We bring an input, hopefully with our creative insight and with Allah's help and the purity of our hearts, we can understand something from this data. Shaheed Mutahhari has an interesting point in one of his books in regards to education. He says that the stomach, I don't know if this is biologically true, but bear the metaphor, maybe you know better, but I really found it interesting. That if you don't give the stomach food, it will start to eat itself, digest itself. I don't know if this is true, but it makes sense. When the body enters survival mode, it probably does that. And he said the same thing happens to the mind. If you don't give the mind useful information, it will use the limited piece of information and knowledge it has to conjure up theories and ideas that probably are not true or are not mirrors of the real world. So as important as it is to be critical, to have a critical mind, not to just receive. Yes, receive and analyze. كونوا نقاد الكلام. Be those, Imam al-Qadhim alayhi salam, be those who critique the speech when they hear it. But also increase your input data. It's very, very important. Sometimes we think we know enough, and now it's time to turn our analytical machines and just say whatever we think comes to our minds. And our brain is fantastic in that. It just connects every random thing together. Right? And sometimes we fall out of that line that the salawat said. Al-muta'akhiru ankum zahiq. We fall behind and we'll go or we exceed in that manner. That's in terms of history. Something more anthropological and something social is honestly, once again, bewildering. And this is a question many ask as well. The Sunnis themselves ask. Those who are converts to Islam ask, and I'm sure you have asked yourself, how is it possible that after such a magnanimous event, such an official and famous and popular event that everyone has, until today, one of the probably the most narrated event in the history of Islam and Muslims, yet the companions, those who loved the Prophet, those who gave their lives for Islam, fought wars. Look at the descriptions given in Medina. How were these people living? Sharing clothes, living on one date. Grown men, living on one date in states of war. Sacrifice. Companions of Rasulullah sacrificed. They gave everything to Islam. How is it possible that we can propose that these companions, after they heard what they heard in such an official manner, somehow turned their back to the will of the Prophet, the one that was most beloved to them? It's surprising. It honestly is surprising. What happens to a group of people in such a large number that they collectively decide to ignore the directions and the guidelines and the final will of someone who they admire so much? Let's bring an analogy from history or another example where this has happened, so at least we can begin to say, look, it's at least possible. How it's possible, maybe we can discuss. But has it happened before? If it's happened before once, then we can say, okay, it will happen again. The story of Musa alayhi salam. He disappears for how long? 30 days. He says, look guys, I'm going on a sabbatical. Kalimullah. He would speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has asked me to speak with him in private, in solitude for 30 days. It's initially 30 days. Okay? And this is where the trial begins. He leaves for 30 days and does not return, because Allah says we extended it for another 10 days. This is the very words of the Quran. Now, this extension is enough for a group of people, from what I remember, 500 to 600,000 people. Qawm Bani Israel at that time was that number. That was enough for them to not only forget Harun, who was, and they knew, they didn't dispute that part. They knew Harun is the appointee. They know who Harun is, alayhi salam. They're not saying we want someone else instead of Harun to be the head of matters. No. Yeah, Musa chose you, salamullahi alayh. But we have no beef with that. No pun intended. But they chose to exit the religion. Completely leave the religion. Start to worship a cattle. Now that has its reasons also. But like I said, we're just trying to find occurrences where this at least gives us some reassurance, like that it's possible. If someone says, how it's possible, we'll say, have you read the Quran? Do you know about Qawm Bani Israel? They left their religion. How it's possible, you got to go look into the factors of why it became a possibility. People are different. Cliched statement, but very important statement. And it's always a key to solving these types of questions. Even if all Muslims at that time had pure intentions, as we like to think that most Muslims at that time had pure intentions for Muslims and Islam and for the Prophet and the Quran. Yet, because you and I are different, You have a greater and higher intellectual capacity than me. You have different life experiences. That one companion is Salman and the other one's a Bedouin. Their understanding of what the Prophet gives them is automatically different, even if they have no evil intentions. So the introduction, if you like, or the formation of different understandings of Islam was bound to happen. It was happening during the time of the Prophet and the Imams. During the time of the Imams, we have companions fighting each other, because they understood what the Imam had said differently. Nowadays, a particular marja' says something, one person takes it one way, he's still living, he's there, we can contact him. At least those days there was the barrier and the difficulty of travel and all that comes with it. So it's normal for people to have different understandings and interpretations of what the holy figure and the divine appointee says. Fair enough. But this is not why the companions and the Muslims as a whole chose to put aside the will of the Prophet. There's more. We have to assume as one, I'm not going to mention all the factors, but at least one factor. We have to assume that there were people who had motivations, not in the sense that we assume that everyone had pure intentions, but for something of this type to happen, then a similar story to Musa alayhi salam and his people need to happen. You had someone who deceived the people. Things organically just don't lead this way. There has to be an intervention, external intervention by individuals who had a motivation for authority, for power. And Islam, yes, it was nascent, it was new. There was still, but there was clearly, if they, in the last days of the Prophet's life, the Prophet took an army to the Roman Empire. That's brave. It's not he's not relying solely on the angels coming in to fight with him. No, the angels don't come to help if there's no will from the people. So the Prophet knows, and everyone knows, that we're good enough to take the fight to the Romans. They're not waiting for the Romans to come. Early on the kuffar would come to them and attack Medina. No, we're taking the fight to the Romans. So everyone can see there is potential financially, militarily. Is that a word? Militarily? Good to know. In terms of human resources, being the head of a state automatically wins you fame, influence. There are enough temptations for anyone to be motivated to interfere with the will. The brother described Omar as charismatic. Omar was also violent, the second Khalifa. Maybe that's where the charisma comes from. There were the character of the first Khalifa, Abu Bakr. He was a peaceful pacifist. He had not killed anyone. No one had anything against him. Everyone had against, not everyone, I'm exaggerating, but Imam Ali had killed many from the kuffar. Those who rose against and leveled against Imam Ali, there were some personal grudges. Let's face it, no matter how much we like to bend our necks and say, oh, we're doing this fi sabilillah, but when personal matters come into the game, sometimes it's out of our control. We're subconsciously doing things, and when we come to, do a psychoanalysis after the fact, we're like, oh wow, I didn't even know, and I was doing something because of personal interest, because my brother, sister, father, mother was involved in this setup. Someone has, in a not long ago time, has killed one of your family members. Yeah, now you're Muslim, in al-mu'minuna ikhwa, you're all brothers and sisters. But come on, it's going to get to him. He's a human being. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there were external interventions that were inspired by motivations for power, for wealth, for influence, for authority, that allowed something like that to happen. I'll leave it at that. There's much more to say, and it's very interesting. There's a lot to learn from. My final point, inshallah, we did some history, we did some anthropology. Now let's just make it very basic and apply. This verse, this part of the verse that we keep reciting today, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي. What Allah is telling us is that religion is a system. Religion is multidimensional. It has a variety of components. I think this is a very useful idea. Sometimes maybe this is a problem of us Muslims in the West, or Muslims who have consciously, intentionally, unintentionally become somewhat influenced by the secular idea of religion. Because that's what it is in these countries. Religion is something you do on your own. It's you in that little corner and your God. I'm not trying to create a revolution here. I'm just trying to say that Islam is a system. It's multidimensional. If we reduce our Islam to one dimension of coming to the programs, of thinking these commemorations are needed. If we don't do this, then everything will be forgotten. This is the basis for what we need to do. But if this is all we suffice with, then we don't have Islam. We truly don't have Islam. It doesn't change with how many alhamdulillahs and subhanallahs and how good my Arabic is and how many takbirs I say and how many rak'at of prayer I do, how many programs I hold. The number here is multiplied by 10. Who cares? It's one night. It's 2 nights. Who cares? What happens? What? It's just a spiritual high? People go to clubs and parties to get a high and we get a spiritual high. No problem. Is that what it is? If there is no step taken to really implement Islam as a system in our lives, no joking with ourselves that, we're going to use this appearance. I'm wearing a dishtash and somehow that makes me religious. I've put a bead that makes me more religious. Who cares? If it doesn't touch our core, then we haven't accepted Ghadeer. Because Ghadeer is that, look, God is telling you, you people who have accepted Islam partially, I have something else for you that completes the religion, and it's this idea of leadership. And if you don't accept it, just like the Prophet would have not done his job and would have not done his message justice if he did not proclaim it, you have not done the religion and the message justice if you do not complete it, accept it as a complete system. That's an idea that hopefully I can take home and I can think about it and implement in my life, and all of us can do that. Sorry to have bored you and taken your time for an extensive, I think I was allowed only 20 minutes. I don't know how long I went for, so please forgive me, and may Allah give you and your families tawfiq to continue with these programs. And I mentioned this last night as well in a different program. It's very recommended to feed people during Eid Ul Ghadeer. So shout your friends, shout me as much as you like. I'll accept all invitations. And inshallah we have a great Eid to come. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Ali, alhamdulillah. No doubt, just as you mentioned, if we don't implement the legacy and teachings of Imam Ali to our very core, or try our best to do so, like you said, we just come here to feel spiritual. It's meaningless, means absolutely nothing. So inshallah we can take away the deeper meaning that we want to obtain, that we want to extract, that treasure, that core of the religion, the basis, the foundation. And one point you made, many points, very interesting, but one of the points about how oftentimes we get isolated bits of knowledge or information and we try and connect them with each other in some kind of malformed way, and we come to premature conclusions or assessments of a certain situation. It's interesting because I've always found the more knowledge you gain, the more you realize how much you don't know. And when you approach knowledge in that way, try and humble yourself, not to feel arrogant or superior to someone else. Some of the conclusions that you come up with, you might incidentally also find them in the books from our maraja or our historians. I find this at times. Sometimes you look at the history and you find some connection that also might have been reached by our mufassirin or our historians. You see this as you read, as you understand, but it requires us to build our our knowledge step by step, little by little, and to be very careful in the things that we say, especially in a public platform or anything like that. You know, sometimes when we reach a conclusion and we aren't sure about it, when it's something deeper and beyond our grasp, it's important to keep that to ourselves until we gain more information on that specific matter, so as not to misguide people. Very important point. What you mentioned about Ghadeer Khumm, and oftentimes our brothers might say that this was more of a friendship pact. During Ghadeer Khumm, and this is in Sahih Muslim, narration in Sahih Muslim, in Ghadeer Khumm, the Prophet explicitly says that I am about to give you something. If you hold on to it, you will not go astray. Hadith al-Thaqalain. This was narrated during the event of Ghadeer Khumm. Two things, the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. Hold on to these two. And he says, beware of your responsibility, of your duty towards my family, towards the Ahlul Bayt. Now, interestingly enough, as soon as the Holy Prophet passes away, and again, this is something undisputed in history, you look back, the Ahlul Bayt are wronged one time after another. During Fadak, Bibi Fatima al-Zahra is denied what is rightfully hers, not inheritance, something she rightfully owned. Was that taking care of the responsibility towards the Ahlul Bayt? Of course not. The Muslims ignored this fact. And when you look back afterwards, the events that took place there, you come to realize the wisdom behind what the Holy Prophet had said. Why did he say, be careful of your duty towards my Ahlul Bayt? Because afterwards, the Muslims weren't really responsible. They were neglectful. They did not contemplate on Ghadeer Khumm the way that they should have. And this also links back to the hadith of the pen and paper. On his deathbed, the Holy Prophet is saying these same words. Let me give you something so that you will not go astray. And he's prevented from writing it. You can link these facts together and you can only come to one conclusion, that he's being denied from giving that final will, that final testament. The last point I wanted to make, beautiful point you mentioned, was it Ziyarat Jami'ah? Yeah, how we shouldn't try and exceed our limits, nor should we try and, go below what is expected of us. It's very interesting because Islam, it's all about balance in life, balance between one thing and the other, whether it's spirituality and materialism. Those who try to be overly spiritual, often they fall into the trap of waswasa, being very nitpicky about one thing or another, and it leads them away from the religion, I guess trying to be holier than thou or self-righteous. At the same time, those people who don't pay enough regard to the religion, they fall into the trap of materialism and going in the opposite direction. Now that's the biggest challenge for us, to try and find the right balance between the two of them. And that incident of Ghadeer, some people too far ahead, some people too far behind, it shows that struggle between finding that right balance. And when they're all brought together, Imam Ali is proclaimed, because Imam Ali and his example, that's the point of balance that we need in our lives. So inshallah we can do exactly that. Jazakallah khair. Sheikh Ali, please recite a loud salawat for Sheikh Ali Safdari. Inshallah, now we'll move on to our open discussion segment. So what I wanted to start with is an interesting experience that I had myself. I was actually talking to an elder in our community. This was years ago. He was of the point of view that when it comes to our azadari, when it comes to our commemoration or celebrations of the lives of our imams, or when it comes to Islam in general, we shouldn't be overly conceptual. We shouldn't look too deep into things. We shouldn't look at the history or the narrations and try to conceptualize them, dig into them. Why? Because he felt that if you do that, if you look into the narrations of Islam, you run the risk of losing the religion. But I feel that the opposite is true. Because his point of view was that we should keep our remembrance of the Imams limited to just rituals without any deeper meaning behind them. Rituals without life, essentially. So, are you leaving? All right. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Once again, salawat for the Sheikh. I guess we can move back closer now. All right, so that was an interesting discussion that I had with the elder of the community. He was of the point of view that you should not look into the religion of Islam too much because you run the risk of losing your religion, essentially. Instead, you should just come as a kind of way to honor culture, I guess. You should honor culture by coming here, chanting the name Ali, chanting the name Hussein, beating your chest, reciting a few lines of poetry. He honestly believed that that was the way to preserve the faith or the Islamic culture or tradition or whatever, because otherwise we might lose our way. We might find a fact that's too great for our minds, too overwhelming, and because of that we can end up leaving the religion. But I believe honestly and wholeheartedly, if you enter a journey of knowledge, if you look into the religion wholly and completely with an open mind, with an objective view, and you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep you firmly on the straight path, to keep you guided, and at the same time you try and live a proper life that is befitting of a Muslim, that is befitting as a follower of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam. If you do these things, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not let you go astray. That's our form of protection. We don't need security in denial. You know the very famous saying, ignorance is bliss. That's essentially what he was saying. But again, I feel the opposite is true. Those are my thoughts, and it's very important because it links back to the saying of Imam Ali I mentioned earlier, لا يستعان على الدهر إلا بالعقل. Nothing can withstand the vicissitudes of time, the changing times, except for reason or intellect, not culture, not mindless ritual. Again, I feel those things are important, no doubt. Have those latmiya, that poetry, but that's an expression of love. It's not the love in and of itself. It's just the expression of it. It's like, for example, let's say I buy the world's most expensive shoes and I don't have feet. What's the point? Or let's say I buy the world's most expensive mobile phone cover and I don't have a mobile phone. It's useless. This is something very important that we need to remember. These go hand in hand, but the core, that's the most important, the core of the religion. So that's an interesting point I wanted to begin with, and I'd like the brothers to share their insight on that as well. Yes.
I'm going to get Brother Hussein in here, big trouble. I'm sorry. I highly recommend momentary atheism for the Muslim community. It sounds a bit weird, but and I think the Imam Ali, not in a negative way, but he's an amazing trickster of the mind to get you to think outside the box. You know, he says, I am the first, I am the last. He comes up with these riddles. What contains the whole world, yet is smaller than a grain. You know, and really he's getting you to think outside the box, and you have to doubt yourself. You have to doubt your reality. But that is the essence of Islam. You must say La ilaha, that there is no God, before you say Illallah. Hence, I say that momentary atheism is highly encouraged in Islam because it allows for free thought. A wise man once said, there are those who think in the box, there are those who think outside the box, and then there are those who think without a box. And I think the duty of a Muslim is to think without a box. And really what that comes down to is knowing all levels of understanding. Understand the polytheist, understand the atheist, and then understand true submission, which is Islam. So to the story that you gave, I would say that yes, rituals are great for enshrining values, key fundamentals of understanding, but sometimes we have to question the fundamentals of our fundamentals, epistemology. And if we don't, we're just as guilty as the Quran says, do not follow the religion of your forefathers. And I think that applies even to Muslims. We have to critically think, and hence in the prayer, the 5 daily prayers, we affirm our oath to God. We should be rethinking our fundamentals, our values, every moment of our lives. Not every moment consciously, but in practice, that we should be critical of ourselves before we are critical of others.
Absolutely right. No doubt we should. Just as you mentioned, the religion of the forefathers, we're no different than the people who are condemned in the Quran. We're just as guilty. And I feel if a Muslim doesn't do his just dues in terms of investigating, learning, thinking for himself, as you mentioned, La ilaha comes before illallah. Pause at that point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to pause. He wants you to empty all other thoughts, all other distractions, whatever it might be, whether it's worldly, spiritual distractions, everything. Make your mind one complete blank. And then you say, illallah, illallah, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala truly enters your mind. It's kind of like an analogy I always give. If you have a glass that is filled with, let's say, muddy water or something like that, before you can fill that glass with clean water, you have to empty it, you have to clean it. This is what we're doing in our minds when we say La ilaha. We're throwing all of that away, and then we're saying illallah. We're giving ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way we should. So when you mentioned that momentary atheism, I wouldn't call it that, but I do respect I guess the crux of your argument or your point. It's something very important that inshallah we can all learn from. Brother Mustafa, anything to add?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that you made, Brother Sadiq. He said momentary atheism. That's something that I went through. Not atheism, but I wanted to accept Shia Islam as sort of like a convert, and not like my parents just like handed a religion down to me. And this took place when I was going through high school. I started looking at the religion purely from the sayings of the Imams, and I wanted to see how that differentiated from how I was raised and how I was taught about the religion. And I realized that the one thing that kind of blew my mind was how the Imams, every time the companions used to ask the Imams a question, they would always answer everything in like the most profound, like Brother Sadiq said, like it's almost like riddles, whereas it's actually like such weighted insight that it can't be like unraveled by like a fool. It requires like a philosophical mind. It requires a lot of intellect to unravel the sayings of the Imams, right? And then so you have these figures that, to their own merit, their greatest merit being their knowledge that is grounded by insight and wisdom. And then I went to the madrasa, I went to the mosque every day, and I realized like that's not the trait, to apologize, that's not the trait of Muslims. And that's what blew my... Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. That's not the trait of Muslims. Muslims, they're not putting knowledge as their forefront value. Whereas that is the value of the Imams and their closest companions. And so that kind of blew my mind how the Quran begins Suratul Yasin wal Quran al-Hakim, the Quran full of wisdom. And then I looked at how the Muslims viewed the Quran, and it's viewed as sort of like you said, a book like of rituals. Like we use it, we dust it off from the shelf and we use it to begin a lecture, and that's when we put it back. We bring it back out again during Laylatul Qadr. We put it in our head and we put it back on the shelf. And I was starting to think like, what is the purpose of this Quran? If you look at the Quran and you examine like the verses of the Quran, it's so like meticulously put together. It's so like well worded. Each word, it's not like a storybook. It's so worded in such a way that it's only there to really like derive wisdom from it. In fact, if you look at the Quran, when it talks about the people of the cave, God says, I'm not going to even tell you how many people are in the cave, because that doesn't mean anything. Why the hell are you wasting your time on that, right? That's how much emphasis the Quran puts on its own worth of value when it comes to wisdom and knowledge. Whereas the Muslims didn't put their value behind that. They put their value behind the ritualism of memorization and recitation. And I think that's, we sort of like missed the mark on that aspect, in the sense that, if you ask a Muslim, like, why is it such that memorization and recitation is the biggest thing? Well, people say, well, the Prophet says to, recite the Quran in a beautiful voice. Yeah, that's true. The Prophet also said, for example, when you make a Quran hardcover, make it in a beautiful text. That's not the whole purpose of the Quran, for God's sake, right? You beautify the Quran, you put it on a good shelf. Yeah. That's not the whole purpose of it, right? When you do your salat, you wear your fine clothes and this, that, but that's not the entirety of the performing of that deed. The same thing of the imams, we've sort of like taken them on as sort of in a fanatic kind of way, in a way that we've seen them as not scholars. This is the interesting thing. If somebody loves a university scholar, right, they admire them for their knowledge and they seek to gain that knowledge from them as sort of like someone hungry for their wisdom and knowledge. Whereas Shias, I realized growing up, it wasn't the case. And that's when I started to see, like Brother Ali Safdar was talking about how the Muslims at the time of the Prophet, they looked like they followed the Prophet. And as soon as the Prophet passed away, they just started like dispersing. You should put it on silent. I think my phone's. They started dispersing immediately, right? And so I started to think to myself, are we as Shias like that? Don't we fear for ourselves that we are those same Muslims at the end of the day? That we will eventually start dispersing when the 12th Imam comes, right? That's a very valid question. Because, are our values the same as the Muslims at the time of the Imam Ali when they didn't obey him, they didn't follow his wilayat? Are they, what values do they hold, right? Were they just mindless ritualism? Did they just mindlessly follow the religion? Did they just come from a Bedouin background and they didn't have knowledge as their forefront merit? Are we just replications of that? Are we retelling history in that sense, right? When you look at Imam Ali, when he talks about, to his own companion, he says, I'll trade 10 of you men for one of Muawiyah's men. I think that was really interesting. Because if you look at our grand scholars today, our grand scholars give a ruling on, for example, Shia Sunni unity, and then we have a lot of Shias dispersing and disagreeing and disputing about that matter. And sort of it reminds me of if you look at fanatics and dictators throughout history, just like Muawiyah, these people, if you look at Trump supporters, Trump and Giuliani, you'll tell them to raid the Capitol, and these guys will do it. They won't even question it, right? But our Mirajas grand scholars give a ruling, and we're all in dispute about it. It makes me think about that. And am I one of those companions, like Brother Ali said, that for my Imam will I, be led astray because I don't have my values in the right direction? With that, I'd like to hand it back to Brother Hussein. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
One last thing, just to add to the points that have been made here. I think the ritualism and the ritual culture is not the traditional way Islam was manifested. I think this is a byproduct of colonialism, and the last thing that you can hold on to is culture. So we can't blame, for example, our grandparents for what we've inherited. However, there is a solution to it, and with the rituals that we have, there's a line in The Last Samurai. It's a beautiful film if you guys ever get the chance to watch it. At the very end, there's this guy called Katsumoto, and he dies, and then the representative comes to the emperor, and the emperor said, "How did he die?" Right? To which the last samurai, the white guy in the film, says, "I'll tell you how he lived." And I think if we just pause and we have the rituals, we know the imams, we know their names, but if we pause and reflect not on how they died, but rather how they lived, and the lives that they lived as scholars and influencers, I think the world would be a better place.
Inshallah, no doubt, brother. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I guess just to conclude the night, I would like to add a very important verse from the Quran, which kind of accentuates all of the points that were made. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. كَذَلِكَ يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ آيَاتِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. In Surah Al-Baqarah, I was just reading it now because I forgot the Arabic. Had to go back to my phone, recall. So it says that we have made these verses, these ayat clear to you so that you may use reason, aql. That's the quintessential feature that Islam possesses, that if we do not honor, just as we mentioned, we're just like those polytheists who follow the religion of their forefathers. It's actually an interesting point you made, that this ritualistic view of the religion is a byproduct of colonialism. I hadn't thought of that before, but it's quite interesting. So inshallah ta'ala, we can, as I mentioned, we can be the agents of change to, alter the way we look at things, the way we do things, the way we hold our programs. One point Brother Mustafa was mentioning, it's kind of lost on me now. It's just, I've been kind of all over the place. What was he mentioning? That yes, how we should constantly ask ourselves, are we in danger of becoming like those who fled from Uhud? Are we in danger of being like the people of Kufa? Are we in danger of following into this mass majority of essentially sheep, people who don't think, who just act on a whim? When we approach Islam on a purely cultural way, then we do run that risk. When we're too narrow in our approach, when the Imam comes, for example, and his approach to the religion, imagine that it's completely different from nearly everything we've learned. Hypothetically, let's say it's completely different. Are we going to say, oh, this isn't the Islam I learned from this person or that person, from my father, from there, from here? How can I possibly believe this to be true? We'll be overwhelmed by the changes that he might bring. And all of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one after another, if you look at this historically, they've brought forth a message, something that sparks change in society in such a way that is overwhelming to the vast majority of people. And because of that, we become afraid, we become, doubtful, this and that. But if we do employ our intellect, if we understand the deeper message and the core of what the Imams represented, we'll recognize any kind of change that the Imam might bring. We'll see, okay, this reflects what the previous Imam said here, what that might have meant, because you think about it that way, you contemplate. And that's an interesting point, because it goes back to another saying of the Holy Prophet: an hour of contemplation is worth 70 years of prayer, something to that effect, or 70 years of worship. Contemplate, think about these things, think about the sayings of the Imams, the verses of the Quran in a deeper way, reflect upon them. Inshallah, with that I'd like to end, unless any of the brothers have anything final to say. Inshallah, we'll conclude for tonight. Please recite Allah's salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.